Growing Up Weird.
Hi, and welcome to Growing Up Weird, the podcast where we explore how the earliest chapters of Western childhoods shape the health stories that we then carry into our adulthoods. Are you ready? Have you got a cup of tea? Good. We begin, as ever, with the news.
First piece of news, we're outside. We're on the bikes. We figured that we should actually practice what we preach, get a bit more movement in, and instead of podcasting from the lounge floor, we're now trying podcasting from the bikes on the busway. So, if you can hear a lot of squawking and screeching, that is not me on my bike, that is the various birds and lake life. I assume fish make a noise, who knows. If you can hear squeaky brakes, that's my bike, not Gwen's. Gwen's is a pinnacle of efficiency.
Like me.
Yeah, just like you. Other than the news of us being outside, do you have any news, Gwen?
I do, Greg, and I actually have two pieces of news.
Hey,
I'm just bringing the
multi-news.
changes, but the first one's pretty short because I can't actually access the paper.
Okay, paywall. Let's hear your first piece of paywall news.
So, first piece of paywall news is from Wang et al. In The Lancet, published a couple of days ago, and it's looking at how fathers influence offspring health
Interesting.
from preconception.
Oh.
And so what they've done is they've apparently, paywall, linked together
Hey,
biological aspect, social aspect, and looked at how a man's health course from childhood through to adulthood affects both his own health behaviours and the health behaviours of his partner to influence their future offspring's health. And I think what's pretty cool about this is that there are... Sorry, I'm starting to breathe heavily now
Slow
because
down.
I've got to slow down. I cannot keep cycling hard and
Don't
talking.
worry. These people can't see how quickly they're going. They can hear us.
They
They
can
can't
just
see us
judge me.
poodling along.
Okay, so, but a lot of health research focuses on the role of the mother in influencing offspring health,
Yep.
but often really neglect the contribution that fathers make, which is enormous. It's just really under-recognised.
Yep.
So,
Thank
they
you.
were trying to say, look, we shouldn't, when we think about health policy, we can't just focus on mothers. We need to recognise the environment which she lives and the environment which her partner lives and set them both up to help their offspring.
Interesting.
And they also looked at the effects, especially on black and brown men, of the racism throughout decades and centuries, and how that influences health, and also how they're involved in their offspring's lives. So they were looking at a couple of different case studies to understand how better health policy can think about both fathers and mothers in setting up their children for long-term health.
Interesting. Okay, so piece of news, but also a piece of meta news. Paywalls suck.
Yes, exactly. So this is why I'm not fully reviewing the paper. Readers, it's very frustrating.
Lancet, we expected better from you. A little bit. We didn't expect that much. Okay, can I chuck one in?
Yeah, go for it.
I have a piece of news out of the NYU Pain Center, which has been putting out some interesting papers for a couple of years now. This one was led by Cara Margolis and her team, and was published in Gastroenterology without paywall, sorry, last week. And they are reacting to the growth in interest around disorders of the gut-brain interaction. Okay. So there's, over the last 5 to 10 years, been a lot done on gastroesophageal reflux disease, irritable bowel syndrome, functional dyspepsia, functional constipation, functional diarrhea, and how they all tie together as disorders of how quickly your gut is moving in any one place at any one time. Very early in this research, a study of 40,000 Danish women showed that women who had untreated depression when they had young babies went on to be the mothers of children and later adults with disorders of gut-brain interaction.
Interesting. Okay, untreated specifically. Okay.
Indeed. So they thought, oh, that's interesting. People who have susceptibility one seem to have a susceptibility to the other.
Yeah.
Some American researchers a couple of years later, did a study on 12,000 kids who'd had any form of adverse childhood event and said, it's not just depression, it's any form of hardcore stress during early childhood leads to an adulthood with disorder of gut-brain interaction.
Interesting.
And they went, okay, maybe it's still some sort of weird correlation. So what Cara Margolis did, and was published last week on, was took a bunch of mice, stressed them out when they were tiny babies, and she stressed them out in the potentially least stressful way. Oh, hey, good morning. This is great. We get to podcast and there are just people around. It's lovely. Stress them out by removing them from their mothers for 2 hours at a time and then giving them back.
Okay.
Which has got to be very stressful when you are that tiny,
The worst
little
thing that's
blind
ever
pink
happened
thing.
to them.
Yeah, exactly. The worst experience of your life. Anyway, guess what they found?
Do mice get IBS?
They get a whole range of diarrhea, constipation, gut pain, all sorts. The exact same symptoms as humans
Fascinating.
at around the same time. So early adulthood onset.
Ah,
There you go. I bring this to you
Fascinating.
because we've been talking about disorders of gut-brain interaction for a while, and this is one that really links together the mechanism and says, look, there is no correlation here. This is causation. If you stress out kids very, very, very early on, you are more likely to get disorders of gut-brain interaction in adulthood. We don't know exactly how yet, but this isn't correlation, this is causation. There you go. Thought I'd bring that to you.
yeah.
We can talk about how to fix that in a later podcast.
Yeah. I think it's worth also highlighting that is separation from the mother for 2 hours. How many times?
Once a day.
Once a
for
day.
a while.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, super interesting. And it actually sets me up very well for my next piece of news. Greg, would you like to hear
listen.
that?
Hang on a second. Let me just navigate these lights. Okay, tell me.
So, also, my goodness, it's actually on theme for the whole podcast. I
Hey.
feel like we're going to have a heavy microbiome gut-brain axis podcast.
I love it.
So my paper is from Frontiers in Pediatrics by Shiratani et al. A couple of days ago. And it's on the subject of fecal microbiome transplants for children with autistic spectrum disorder.
Okay.
And this is something I know we've been talking about for years because there have been some pretty studies that have shown really significant effects,
Like
but in
enormous
small
effects.
group sizes.
Yeah, sure.
And this one is no exception.
Okay.
But just to give you a little bit of prior information here, because I think it's important in terms of how we think about the outcomes of this study. Quite a long time ago, parents of children with autistic spectrum disorders noticed that in some cases, if the child had antibiotics, you got some changes in their symptoms, like quite significant changes. And so that was when people started to say, oh gosh, is this primarily a microbiome related disease? And I'm not going to put any money on what sort of quote unquote primary causes are here. But what has become increasingly clear over the years is that the gut microbiome, presumably other microbiota too, play very significant roles in shaping some of the symptoms of autism spectrum disorder.
Yeah, okay.
The extent to which it is causative versus secondary is unclear, because we know that things that slightly disrupt microbiome development in early life seem to mildly increase the risk of autism spectrum disorder.
Yep.
We also know that a lot of children with ASD have very selective diets,
Yep.
which then you've got this
Chicken and egg situation.
chicken and egg situation. But what these researchers did was they were looking at whether you can give microbes from feces of a healthy donor
Yep.
in a way that doesn't involve absolutely trashing the microbiome first.
Okay.
Because in general, for most of these studies, they've required children to have antibiotics, often very hardcore antibiotics, bowel cleansing, which is basically unpleasant stuff where you give children things to, in effect, wash out their gut, and then try to recolonize with the microbes from a healthy person's stool.
Yep.
And this is pretty hard going, as you can imagine. So what this study was looking at was can you put the microbes in a base of a fluid, which you
Okay.
then give as an enema
Okay.
once a week for 6 weeks? Which still, I mean, it's a lot of. So
Yeah.
it's
quite a lot of
It's not a small undertaking. But can you, if you use this fluid, does it mean that you can get away with significant improvements in symptoms without the requirement for trashing the microbiome first?
Okay, and?
And this fluid was, Greg, and I know we've talked about this quite recently, was hydrogen nanobubble water.
Oh, interesting.
Which sounds
we
like...
did talk about this recently.
No, it sounds like the biggest jargon phrase I could possibly
It
imagine.
sounds like the biggest load of holistic nonsense
It
you've
does,
ever heard.
doesn't it? Yeah, absolutely.
Quantum energy fluctuation water.
Exactly. But what's increasingly being recognised is that hydrogen itself has got a strong anti-inflammatory effect. Greg, what's that about?
So, okay. This first popped up while I was looking at free radical scavenging in the brain as a potential therapeutic direction for Alzheimer's.
Okay.
As you know, when your respiration in your mitochondria goes a little wonky, they start kicking out oxygen free radicals and reactive oxygen species of all sorts. Those then zip around the cell and smash into things and basically rust little holes into things. They oxidize like crazy. Getting rid of those is what antioxidants are about. So vitamin E, vitamin C, a bunch of other things. All your healthy little polyphenols. But one thing about all those molecules, a lot of them, is they don't get through the blood-brain barrier because they're too big. Hydrogen is famous for bonding with oxygen because that's how we get water. And that does get through the blood-brain barrier because it's way tiny. In fact, there is no smaller molecule. So giving people hydrogen has been shown to be a very effective antioxidant, and with that reduction in damage comes a reduction in inflammation. So it's been shown to have anti-inflammatory properties too. Carry on.
So that's exactly the reason I think these researchers tried it, and I'm going to put this big caveat in here. Also, there is certainly overlap with one of their at least commercial interests. So we'll talk a little bit about why we shouldn't necessarily put huge faith in this paper in a moment. But so what they suggest is that something about the inflammation modulating activity of the hydrogen nanobubble water helps to give better microbial colonization and maintenance than without. Which is super interesting. And actually, I should just tell you the results. The results were very, very impressive. So I think on average, there was a 30% reduction in ASD symptoms. There were 30 children, the whole population was 30 children. So again, this is a tiny study. But of those children, 19 of them went from moderate to mild symptoms of ASD, and 6 children went into the normal range for symptoms of ASD.
Wow.
And the symptoms they looked at were not only physical, like gastrointestinal health, stool consistency, etc., but also how well they interacted with other people, and their depression and anxiety ratings, which are also much higher, usually went down very significantly. In fact, that was the biggest change.
Fascinating.
But particularly interesting was that this group of kids with ASD included both children with gastrointestinal symptoms and kids without.
Okay.
And the biggest difference was with the children without gastrointestinal symptoms. Very interesting, but it was a very small sample size. So I think I'm just going to caveat this paper heavily. One, there is conflict of interest. 2, very small sample size, as is with anything where you have a very significant intervention like that. It becomes very expensive very quickly. And 3, there were a few poorly worded or inaccurately worded pieces in papers. And this is always difficult because you think, is this because for the author, English is a second language, does it reflect sloppy research throughout? So caveated, but very interesting, and it certainly adds to the growing evidence base on fecal microbiome transfers for ASD.
Okay, so what's this conflict of interest?
They own a company
That makes hydrogen.
One of them,
Interesting, okay. That is a pretty significant conflict.
It's a pretty significant, exactly, which is why I'm caveating it. But it does lead us on to the main topic of our podcast today, which is the microbiome and why the benefits of the microbiome might not just be about the presence of the microbes in your child's gut.
Oh, okay.
But should we start with, Greg, what are the functions of the microbiome? Should we just go backwards and forwards?
Love to. I'd love some microbiome chat. You know me and the microbiome.
Well, one thing I would say is that I was teaching some Cambridge vet students the other day, and I was surprised at how little they knew about the microbiome. So even though we spend all of our days immersed in microbes, it is remarkable how little of that information gets out to other people. So why then is the gut microbiome so important?
Are we limiting ourselves to the gut microbiome here?
Oh, okay. We can take it up. We can take it up a step.
Up a step?
Yeah.
I think it would be fair to say that all human surfaces are colonised with microbes.
Yeah.
External surfaces anyway.
Yeah.
There is some debate over whether the internal surfaces, such as the inside of your blood vessels, are full of microbes. I would say maybe not full, but there's some around. So your external surfaces, your skin, your lung, your eye, your gut, have significant quantity of microbes on them. In many cases, those bring with them processes that we can't do just as our mammalian selves. So the production of certain enzymes that we can't make in our gut to break down things that we couldn't otherwise break down, cellulose being the perfect example. All those bits of plants that we call roughage or fiber are indigestible for mammals. But they can make cellulase, they can break down the stuff, and if we give them a nice little home to live in, they'll do it for us. Brilliant. That's how a cow or a horse works, or a rabbit, or a goose to some degree. Same thing goes on the skin. You want antimicrobial peptides to protect you from disease? Your microbes can make those. You want a nice little layer of acid to protect you from other things? Your microbes can make that. So yeah, they do a whole bunch of jobs for us. What other jobs do you think they do, Gwen?
They often help maintain the actual integrity of our barriers. So they work together with our cells because it's in the best interest of both the body and the microbes to have an ecosystem that supports those particular microbes. So gut integrity.
Yep.
They make vitamins.
They do.
We've talked about preventing colonisation by pathogens. And they also, as we've talked about in both of our news today, influence even how our brain works through our gut-brain axis.
Okay, good. So mega useful. Is what I'm hearing.
Yep.
And we have talked before about where you get them, right?
Yep.
That you get them from your mother at birth, assuming a proper, messy, normal physiological birth. That you get them by walking around, accidentally eating mud and stuff on vegetables. That you get them by stroking pet animals, or even by breathing in high diversity, dusty air.
Yep.
Any other directions?
No, I think that's most of them.
Okay. So, why are we talking about them today?
Because even though most of us, well, many of you listening to this podcast certainly will be at least a bit familiar with the microbiome, it can be really hard to get children to do behaviours that are supporting their microbiome, such as eating lots of different fruits and vegetables, such as trying to keep themselves healthy, in general, reducing the risk of needing antibiotics, a bunch of things that we are trying to get children to do that is quite hard to get them to do.
Okay.
And so one of the things that we found that works really well is to talk about the microbiome with children from a very young age, but use it as a way to help them understand what they need to do, have responsibility for what they do, and be able to influence their future behaviour based on some really good stories when they're small.
So this is where we come to monsters, right?
This is where we come to monsters.
I read your piece about the microbiome as a monster, and I love it. I don't think we should go into the whole cultural dimension of monsters just here, but if anybody wants to know more about how monsters guide childhood, definitely have a look at the podcast and follow some of those links. But what I can say is that if you consider the idea of something that you don't understand, but nevertheless you thoroughly believe in, you've got the basis of a monster, right?
Yeah.
And this goes for the one that lives under the bed that encourages you strongly to pick your feet up, or the one that lives at the bottom of the stairs that only comes out when the light goes off, so you have to run up the stairs. Those are things you do because of belief. And you're saying that microbiome could be treated in the same way?
Exactly. And what you do is, when you tell a story about the microbiome, you can help children to see it as a farm, as a community inside themselves that only they have the ability to look after. So
Okay.
in the article, I give lots of examples of how we can talk about what your microbes need, about how we can help children who aren't sure they want to try something by listening to their microbes. There are all sorts of things that we are able to do once the microbes become a monster story.
Little microbial mascots.
Little
Love it.
microbial mascots.
Okay, I can see that. Can you give me an example of how you might talk about the microbiome in this way?
Absolutely. So one of my favourite ones to do, especially when my daughter was smaller, was to listen to her microbes and hear what they were saying when she was eating different foods.
Yep.
And this is quite easy for foods that they like, because you can help them to differentiate between foods that feed their microbes and foods that don't.
Yep.
So when they're eating a meal, if you listen, it's funny how microbes tend to say, yeah, we love this, when they're eating plants, and then they just seem a little bit sad when you're not. But then if you want them to eat other plant-based foods, you can ask them what their microbes would think of them before they eat them. You can listen to what the microbes are saying when they're just holding them, and then you can be extremely excited as they start to chew and swallow because the microbes like them. And it also helps a child to learn the difference between foods that you like, first off, for you, and foods that your microbes really like, and the importance of actually, during life, being able to eat foods that we don't always find delicious first time we try them.
Nice. Okay, I like that. And I can see actually a link that I hadn't considered, which is that between monsters. I mean, we don't really have monsters in our culture. I mentioned two that I have personally, but they're not really cultural monsters. But now I think about it, we're not talking about monsters like, I don't know, horror film monsters. We're talking about the accepted fictional characters.
Yeah.
This is Microbes as Father Christmas, is what it is.
Yes, microbes is a tooth fairy.
This is Microbes as the Tooth Fairy.
Yeah.
I love that. Okay, fine. And as you end your article, which I loved, it's a monster, a fictional character that eventually you can say, oh no, they're real. Look,
Yeah.
grab a microscope, I'll show you.
Yeah, exactly.
I like that.
Keep the magic.
Exactly.
And I think if you understand, if you feel intuitively like these things are part of you,
Yep.
from when you're really tiny, that's going to shape how you think about your body right through your life.
Yep.
Really, really powerful effect of a tale.
Nice. Okay, excellent. We're rapidly running out of road here. We've got time for a listener question?
Yeah, and actually this is less of a listener question than it is a statement that made me see something in a completely different way.
Okay.
And that was, I was talking with a veterinary colleague about animal welfare. In animal welfare, we often talk about stereotypies, and these are repetitive, identical patterns of movement that have no function. So it is a horse that bites onto a gate and
It's your hamster doing
huffs and
backflips.
puffs. Huh?
Is your hamster doing backflips?
The hamster doing backflips. Yeah, absolutely. The cat that sucks a blanket.
Yep.
And I think about this a lot because I used to work in animal behaviour modification, especially I saw a whole bunch of stereotypic behaviours. But actually what my colleague said was that a friend of hers was trying to find second-hand primary school jumpers, and she noticed that there are very few second-hand jumpers because so many children suck and chew the cuffs. And she said, in any other cohort of animals, we would have said, these are animals that where their environment doesn't meet their needs. And I don't know, I feel like
Oh, God,
it was
that's grim.
it was really grim. I was like, oh gosh, there are loads of behaviours that fall into this category of stereotypic behaviours, and they even call them stereotypic behaviours, which I didn't know, but that reflect an abnormal environment in which the animal is being kept. And some of those we understand what the links are. thumb or finger sucking is much more common for children who haven't breastfed, because they're missing that key environmental stimuli, so they direct onto others. But then things like pacifiers and dummies, really interesting one, because these are ones where we introduce a stereotypy as a normal part of childhood.
Interesting.
Which, again, is just very thought-provoking. I think once we realise that stereotypies in animals are now increasingly recognised as behaviours caused by an abnormal environment, it does make us think quite hard about some of these repetitive movement patterns that we see in children. And given that, obviously we often think about children with neurodevelopmental disorders being a higher risk, but up to 70% of normally developing children.
You should see Gwen, by the way, doing air quotes.
Air quotes.
With one hand on a bike at 20 miles an hour.
But given that 70% of normally developing children show these as well, it does raise some big questions that we're very aware of, but about how the environment in which we raise children fundamentally dictates how they behave.
Okay, that was not a listener question, but it has shaken me to my core. On that light and fluffy note, you've been listening to Growing Up Weird. I'm Dr. Greg Dickens.
And I'm Dr. Gwen Bradbury.
See you later. Bye.
Bye.